arrays, one of the questions that was asked was, we just did all this stuff, finding the max of an array, filtering out some numbers, filtering out some stuff from an array, looping over an array, cloning an array, doing these things, manually creating these functions, okay? Are we gonna do this, like, do we make these functions, what we would call maybe convenience functions, okay, that will conveniently help us manage our data, right, because an array is a piece of data, and do things with it when we need to? And the answer is no, yes and no. Yes, you will, right, because sometimes your needs, what you need to do is very unique, right? Or sometimes it's very generic. And when it's generic, the language already has a bunch of stuff built in for you. Okay? And we're going to leverage a lot of those. We're going to explore them today. We already looked at some with string and int, number. Now we're going to look at array methods. So we're going back to this concept of a method. Okay, and a method is something that exists already on a collection. So a collection is an array, or an array is a collection. Collections can be other things. We're going to look at these other things later. But for now, when I refer to collection, I'm referring to an array. And we're going to look at Mozilla MDN methods. I've opened up today's course, so I have readings related to today's classes. If you want to follow along on your computer, you're welcome to. We're going to start looking at the documentation. And I think that's the best way for us to learn this stuff. Because as I mentioned before, the documentation can be really heavy. And yes, there are other places that you can get information about this. For example, you can go to W3 Schools. But I feel like W3 Schools might not contain all the information necessary. It's not the official documentation. Whereas MDN, I would consider the official documentation for this stuff. So we're going to start at the beginning with for each. For each. We already know of 2 ways to loop through an array. Well, guess what? I'm going to introduce you to a 3rd one. Because this 3rd one is really the baseline for how a lot of these other things work. And we're going to now start using that thing that I introduced on Friday with function expressions called a callback. And you'll see, hopefully that will also provide clarity to that concept. Because the callback, the way that we use a callback in JavaScript is often used in the majority of these methods, these array methods. And we'll see why, we'll see how, and we'll see what benefit they provide. It'll add clarity to that, okay? So the first one we're going to look at is the for each. Unfortunately, they're using super new syntax here. Let's see if we can find a better one. But this is where we're starting. We're starting here anyways. The for each, we start at the top. At the top, what we're going to get is a short description of this method. Ignore the fact that it says array.prototype. We'll learn about prototypes later. For now, consider this as an array. An array, some array in our system, in our app. It's an array. Maybe it's a variable that contains an array or something else. It's an array, and the method is called for each. Right below that, we get a short description. This is not the full description, this is a short description. The for each method executes a provided function once for each array element. The for each method executes a provided function once for each array element. let's unpack that. What does that mean? This is dense, full of vocabulary. You probably never heard of method until recently. Function, array, element. 4 very, very new words for you. Can anyone try to provide a better explanation? Think?
Is there something like a for loop?
It's kind of like a for loop. Yeah. It's very much like a for loop.
Do this for each of the elements.
Do this exactly. Do this for each element in the array. Perform this block of code. Run this block of code for each element in the array. It just so happens though that that block of code that we're telling it to do is a function. We're saying, here's a function. Run this function once for each element in the array. And provide to that function, and this is the part that's not in there right now, provide to that function the details of that element that you're working on. If we have an array, and I say, I have this function over here, and let's be honest, a function is just a block of code with a name. That's what a function is, right? A function is a block of code. So I have a block of code over here. Who knows what it does? And I'm saying, for each element in this array, run this function. But the piece that's not said on here yet, that we'll scroll down to, provide into this function the important stuff of the array.
As a parameter?
As a parameter. Yeah. So we need some way for our functions to accept information, right? That's what our functions do. We have a block of code, and we want to use some information from this array in our block of code. And so functions are perfect because functions accept data. They accept it as parameters. And so usually there's a little demo below. Unfortunately, a lot of these demos are using super new syntax, arrow syntax we haven't learned about yet. But we will learn about that. This is just a function. Okay? But here's really, this is the syntax of how this works. And this is super complicated. So we're gonna have to break this down. So the syntax is array, and ARR is in italics. That means an array, or an array. So we would go an array dot for each. This is the start. Parentheses. We need to break through this. This is freaking hard. Okay? It's like reading a dictionary for the first time and trying to like read that stuff that's right beside the word on how to pronounce it when you've never learned how. Okay? Then we have callback, current value, index, array, this are. But below it says parameters. The parameters for each, so the parameters for each are a callback, which is the function to execute on each element. It needs to accept between 1 and 3 arguments. This is something I provided. I provide it with this, a callback. And we looked at this before. So a callback is a function. I need to provide for each a function, right? That's what we said before anyways. It takes a function. And so that function can either be, it can literally be a function. Okay? We can actually do that. Traditionally we do function expressions though, and I'll come and change that again after. It accepts between 1 and 3 arguments. So my function, my callback, this is a callback. When I provide a function to a function to run, I'm saying, here is a block of code. I want you to run. That's what I'm telling for each. Here's my block of code. I want you to run this block of code each time you go to the next, for each element. So if there's 10 elements, run this block of code for the first element. Run it for the second element. Run it for the third. Run this function for each element in this array. That's what it's saying. That's what this is saying. And right now, this works. It does nothing, but it works. I've got some problems with this. Like, I literally have some problems here about why it doesn't work. Like, one, my function doesn't do anything. So obviously it wouldn't print anything out. I wouldn't get any display. Okay, fine. Let's make my function do something. Hi. Just prints out hi. It's going to print out hi for each element in the array. So how many times is it going to print out hi?
3.
3 times. Hi, hi, hi. Great. Wow. Super useful. Right? It's not. And we're not using it for its purpose. The purpose is that it's not just so I can, if this array is size 10, I run a function 10 times. The point is that I can take the data from the array, I can take this data, and I can provide it to the function. And then I can do something with that data. But how do I do that? And the answer is, I don't. I don't know how for each works. For each, the function, the actual function is a black box, right? It goes something like this. Function, for each. And obviously we know it's accepting a function, some sort of callback. It does some stuff, which I don't know what it is. And then it does some stuff down here, but I don't know what that is either. But at some point, it calls my function. This is all I know. But it's a black box, and there's a lot of these. I don't know what they do before and after. I don't know their magic. But it doesn't matter, because at some point in time, it will run the function I gave it. It runs an arbitrary block of code. Anything I tell it. It doesn't care. And it says, I'll run whatever you tell me to run when I run my stuff. And I'll even provide you with 3 important pieces of information. I'll provide you with the element, I'll provide you with the index, and I'll provide you with the full array. I'll provide you, because if it's running this block of code once for each element, it's going to give me some information. It's going to put some information into my block of code, into my function for me. I need, though, to to be able to accept that information. So if someone is passing in arguments, how do I accept them in a function? How do I accept arguments into a function? If I wrote a function like this, if I was calling a function like this, how do I access these things? Sorry? Parameters, yeah, parameters. I need to accept parameters in order to receive. It's sending, I am not receiving. So it's sending them, but I'm not receiving them. Now I'm receiving them. Now I can take in data. So remember, I don't know how this works. And JavaScript, it already exists in JavaScript for me. So I'm not going to necessarily speculate on it. So now I have a function that accepts parameters, element, index, array. How do I know this? How do I know that those are the parameters that it's going to pass me? It tells me in the documentation. My callback, a function to execute on each element, it accepts between 1 and 3 arguments. 1, 2, 3. Current value. So if we look here, callback, current value. The current value element, the current element being processed. So this is looping over each element. This is the current one that's being processed. In this case, 1. Current value. Index. Optional. Right? 1 and 3? Well, how do I know if it's 1, 2, or 3? Well, absolutely 1. These other 2 if you'd like. Optional, optional. The index current value in the array. So, so it gives me 2 pieces of information. 1, the value. 2, what is the index of this value? 0. So I get 2 pieces of information for sure, if I want them. And 3, the array. What is the array? 1, 2, 3, the whole thing. So now, in my function, I get all 3 of these pieces of information. So I can console log element plus 5. I can console log index and I can console log the array. Now I'm just showing you very, very simple things. And we'll run this. And it doesn't like that because it's called sum function and not sum function. So each element in my 1, 2, 3 array, each time for each will run through that array. An array got for each. And it will run my block of code. And my block of code receives an element, because that's what for each does. Again, I don't know how for each works on the inside, but that doesn't matter. The documentation tells me it will provide me up to 3 pieces of information if I want it. One is optional, the other 2, one is mandatory, the other 2 are optional. The mandatory one is element, index, array are optional. I don't have to accept those if I don't want to. So I can say, I'm not really interested in those. Those I don't need for whatever work I'm doing in here. All I care about is the element. All I want to do is print out the element. This is fine too. And it says there's no such thing as index. And there's no such thing as array. 6, 7, 8. 1 plus 5, 2 plus 5, 3 plus 5. Or I can take all three. Six, index 0, all right. 7, index 1, all right. If I need 3 pieces, I accept the 3 pieces. If I need 2, I accept 2. If I need 1, I accept 1. If I only want the third, though, I have to take the other 2. That's just how it works. I don't have to use them, but I have to accept them. And then don't worry about this arc. So it tells you the parameters that it accepts. It accepts a callback, and it provides these 3 pieces of information to the callback. And this arc, which is optional and we don't need it. We'll learn about that later. But it's optional, so you don't really need to worry about it anyways. This is required. It's required because it doesn't say optional. And here's the other really big, super important piece. The return path. What does this return? So if I did this, what is in A?
Undefined. Nothing.
No,
Undefined.
undefined. Because what does for each return?
Nothing.
Right? For each is a method, just like a lot of other methods that we learned. And the return value is undefined. That's how we read this. So now the real description. This is the terse description. This is the real description below this. For each calls a provided function, a provided callback function once for each element in an array in ascending order. In order. Starting from lowest to smallest. It is not invoked for index properties that are deleted or uninitialized. See, we're getting super complicated here. For sparse arrays, see the example below. Callback is invoked with 3 arguments. So the callback is invoked with 3 arguments. The value of the element, the index of the element, and the array that is being traversed. If this arg, that second parameter, is provided, it will be used as the callback to this value. Don't worry, you don't know what that is. The range of elements, so you can see how heavy this is. And so you don't have to read all of this, but you can definitely start looking at examples. And then below is just example time. How a bunch of different ways that it's being used. So you can see how heavy this documentation is and why it's so important that we wade through it together. Okay, because this is the real stuff. But the most important stuff isn't these examples. The most important stuff starts and ends usually here. The first half of the description, this syntax, this example, and the for each. Unfortunately, these examples, like I said, have all changed to arrow functions. I wonder if there's a way for us to go back to previous versions of the document. There is not. Okay. So this is the for each function. Now, we're going to take a step away from the documentation for a second, and we're going to look at a way to rewrite this using function expressions that we learned on Friday. Because while this is perfectly acceptable, this is not the pattern you will use most often and not the pattern you will see most often. This is a function declaration, and it works. But this is the pattern that you will likely see the most. inline anonymous inline function expression. This is the pattern you're going to see the most. And this is essentially doing exactly what I'm describing. I am providing a block of code to for each to execute for me. That is what I'm doing. And it's so unimportant that I don't even bother giving it a name. I'm just like, here is a block of code. Do your stuff before, do your stuff after, but in the middle, when you promised me you're going to call my block of code, here's the block of code I want you to run. That's what for each says. For each is saying, I promise that I will run your block of code one time for each element in your array, and I will provide you with these 3 pieces of information. All you have to do is give me some block of code to run. And yes, I can create a function and I can give it a name, but typically that's not how we operate, because I probably won't use that function again, because that function was created just to loop over an array. It was created simply as a block of code for each. And because it was so unimportant and so likely not reusable, I'm just going to do it right in line. I'm just going to, here, I'm not even going to give it a name, because no one's ever going to call this function again. This function, this block of code, is just for you, for each. That's it. So this is called a callback. It's a callback because I'm providing a function as a parameter, as an argument to another function. But this style that I'm using is an anonymous because it doesn't have a name. This function has no name. Inline because it's literally right in line. Function expression. And this is the pattern. Okay. Now, a couple other things that trip up beginners. 1, my function is set up to accept data, right? It's ready and set up to accept 3 pieces of information, 3 arguments. For each has told me it will provide me up to 3 arguments, up to 3 pieces of information, so I know that. But as the thing we know about functions is that just because someone's giving me 3 pieces of information, it doesn't mean I need to accept it. We learned that when we learned about functions. We just saw that today, too, when we were talking about a function that takes 2 parameters, maybe. Okay. So it doesn't mean I need to accept them. It will still give them to me, but I'm not accepting them, so that's okay. The other thing is, it doesn't matter what these are called, because these are my variables for my function. I call them whatever the heck I want to call them. It's going to insert, just like the variables that we create, I can call it anything I want. This data is getting put in there. I can call this box anything I want, because this box is only being used within my block of code. Element, E, John, it doesn't matter. Data is going to be put into this box from for each for me. So it doesn't matter what I call it, but I recommend calling it something thoughtful, right? If it's index, call it index. If it's element, call it element. If you know that you're dealing with a bunch of strings, maybe you call it string, or names, maybe call it a name. Okay? Call it something thoughtful, but it doesn't really matter what you call it. You're not bound by any rules here. Okay? So 4H is a super common one, and you can feel free to use that to loop over your, you're going to use that a lot, honestly. I think you're going to use that a lot because it's nicer than the for loops. This gives you everything you need. Unlike the for of loop, where you don't get the index, here you get both the element and the index and the entire array. You get all the data you need to do whatever the heck you want. So this is a lot nicer for looping over arrays, for traversing arrays, than your for loop. Maybe not as nice as the for of loop, but the for of loop has its limitations. You don't get the index. Here you get the index, so you can do more things with it. You get the index if you want the index. If you don't have to take it. And even if you take it, you don't have to use it. Right? You can always just write it like this and never use it if you don't want to. This is perfectly fine. I'm accepting it, but I'm not using it.
Do you always have to use at least one of the parameters?
No, you don't have to use anything. No. This is just a normal function. Remember, just because you are provided with information, you are in charge of what's going on in here. If you don't use it, that's fine. So that's the big one. This is the big one because a lot of the others are derivative of this concept. They look a lot like this. There's a couple that don't, and I'm going to cover those ones. Okay? There's a lot that don't. But before I go to those other ones that are derivative, I want to look, we'll take a step back, and we'll look at some easy fun ones. Easy fun ones. Okay? So this is for each. Let's look at push and pop. Easy peasy. Right? What does push do? Adds a new element to the end of the array. I don't need to know the length. I don't need to do any looping. I don't need to do anything. Just put it onto the array. Easy. End of the array. End of the array. What does pop do? It pops off the last one. So if we're removing things from the end, I don't want it, I don't want it, I don't want it. Pop, 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 pop.
Question.
Yeah.
When you're removing it, does the pop take the result and if I say console somewhere here, does it like console that?
Excellent and timely question. The question is, does pop return anything? Right? Because this is a method, it's being run. This can return something. This can return something. And without documentation, we don't know that. And so it's really important to go take a look. They're right here, pop and push. Let's take a look at pop. The pop method removes the last element from an array and returns that element. Really, this like 2 sentences are the most important piece of this. You can get by with a lot of documentation by just reading this. The pop method removes the last element, pop, from an array and returns that element, which means not only does it take it off, but now I get it. And this method changes the length of the array. It actually modifies an array. So if I have an array and I pop and I console log last element and then I console log the array, just these 4 lines. 3, pop will take off 3. It will return it and store the value in last element, because that's what pop returns. Last element will be 3, and array will be 1 and 2. So it actually modifies the array. Really super, super key important things. Sounds trivial. Sounds like, whatever. I know what pop does. Very, very, very important. This changes how you write your code. This impacts how you write your code. This impacts how you problem solve around this concept. How do I get this value out? I know how to take values off, but how do I get it? Well, if you knew, if you read the documentation, you would know. Just the first line. No. No. And if we look at the syntax is very straightforward. Pop. This is the syntax. Array.pop. Return value. The removed element from the array, undefined if the array is empty. Then a more pop method, intentionally generic. Does not contain length. So no. And if you read all this, you'll find out that you don't have to go very far to realize that. Once you hit syntax and you don't see some sort of like, you can pop any one off, then you can rest assured that no, you can't. And these ones, this example is pretty good. Okay, let's pop. Push. Let's take a look at push. What do we say about push? It updates the array. Adds something to the end. The push method adds 1 or more. One or more. How do I add more than 1? This we'll have to take a look. Elements to the end of the array and returns the new length of the array. The new length of the array. What does that mean? Is it returning the array? Is it returning an integer? Yeah, an integer that is the new length. Why? I don't know, but maybe that's useful, right? How they decided what it returns, I don't know. Right? In pop, to me that one makes sense. This one kind of doesn't really make sense. Why return a length? I don't really care for the length. The assumption is though, I already have the array, so got to return something. So we can see a little example here. Oh, this is messed up. And if I push comma separated values, chickens, comma cats, comma dogs, it adds all 3 of them to the end. So it's not just one. I can push multiple values as long as they're separated by commas. Push and pop. This is push and pop are in your reading, by the way. Like not this, but reading of the arrays from Friday. Friday I gave you array readings. They're in there, they're at the bottom. So you don't have to wade through the documentation for these ones. We also have shift. Shift is like pop, but for the front.
Yeah.
We pop off the back, we shift off the front. Shift the array over. And if we imagine that the array is sitting on the ledge of a canyon, and I shifted it over, that front value would just fall off the canyon, right? And that's our new array. That's shift. Everything else about shift is pretty much the same. It removes the first element, returns that element, and changes the length of the array. It's identical to pop, except off the front. So if we, instead of popping, we can shift. And we get an array will be 2, 3. Last element is actually going to be first element. It's going to be 1. Shift. So if this is shift, unshift, can anyone speculate what unshift might do? We have a push, we have a pop, add to the end, remove from the end. Shift, remove from the front, unshift, add to the front. I'm unshifting it, right? Here's the canyon, I'm moving it 1 away from the canyon and I'm putting something in the first space. It says unshift. So I can insert at the front or I can insert at the end really easily. And that's unshift. 0. Last element. Let's see what, we'll call it return value. Let's see what return value is of this. What do you expect the return value to be? If push return the length of the array, what do you suspect unshift will return? Probably the same, right? Let's check it out. Yep. And you can see that we're starting to make pretty good educated guesses about these things. And as you begin to program and you start to see these patterns, you start to make really good educated guesses about what's going to be returned, what it probably takes. You'll hop over to the documentation to confirm, because you really do need to know how to use it. When you get a new tool or a new machine at home, you read the instruction manual to really understand it. You have a pretty good idea because you've had a blender before. Not this blender, but a blender. It's got a lot of features that are the same, some new features. Okay, and so you can make educated guesses. We're really good at that. So, push, pop, shift, unshift. Join. Join's a really good one. I like join. Join creates a string out of an array and joins all the elements together. So let's take our an array and let's console.log an array, and let's console.log an array.join. We can do this. It's no different than any other function that returns something. Remember, this gets evaluated first. We'll take a look at the documentation for join right away, but I'm telling you right now, it returns a string. So this will get evaluated to a string and it will return it. So I'm going to console log an array, and I'm going to console log an array.join. Let's take a look to see what that prints out. So when we print out the array, it prints out an array. Join is kind of like a, okay, I get what you're trying to do. You want to print out the numbers in the array or the values in the array in a more pretty manner. And so it creates a string out of that for us. And it injects these commas by default. But if we go look at the documentation for join, we'll learn some pretty interesting stuff. The join method creates and returns a new string. So it's creating a new string and then it's returning it by concatenating all of the elements in the array, or an array-like object, which we'll look at later, separated by commas or a specified separator string. That doesn't have to be commas. It gave us commas, but the documentation says we can make up whatever we want. We can put whatever we want in between these strings. If the array has only one item, then that item will be returned without the separator, right? Because if you only have one, you don't need the comma after it. So it just returns the one, right? If you just have one item, don't put a comma after this one when you're going to print it out, because there's only one. There's no more coming. So it's smart enough to do that. What's the syntax? Array.join, and the separator goes in those parentheses. Here's the parameters. The separator, optional, right? I didn't include it here. It's optional. Specifies a string to separate each pair of adjacent elements. The separator is converted to a string if necessary. If the separator is an empty string, all elements are joined without any characters in between them. So if I do empty string, I get this. If I do a space, 3 spaces, I get this. If I do dashes, I get this. Cool, eh? Totally you could use this for the multiplication. Okay, that's how join works. So these are a little bit outside of what we're looking at for the other ones. They do not follow the same pattern as for each. Okay, they're simpler. And there's a variety of these. If you're interested in learning about the API, these are all coming from the JavaScript API. They're things that JavaScript provides for us. Here's a common task that people need to do. Put commas in between, they print out arrays of stuff. People commonly print out arrays of stuff, and they often need to format them as some sort of string. So here, we've written join for you. It's pretty common people want to add something to the end of the array, Could you do that without pop? Sure, we just did it a bunch of times, but it's clunky. So here's pop, here's push, here's pop, here's unshift, here's shift. On the left-hand side, under methods, there's a bunch of stuff. A bunch of different common things that people like to do with arrays. They like to make arrays from other things. They like to ask, is this thing an array? They like to say, create a new array and fill it with somethings. And if you hover over it, you get those short little, the fill method changes all elements in an array to a value, from start to an end. So I can just make it whatever. I can fill an array with zeros if I wanted to. That's what fill is. What does filter do? What does find do? What do you think find does?
Find the thing, didn't find anyone.
Find an element. The find method returns the value of the first element in the provided array that satisfies a test. So you write a test, and it's going to find the first element that matches. Let's go look at that one. Actually, yeah, let's look at 2. We've got time for 2. And then I'm going to set you off, and you're going to have to explore the rest. But I strongly encourage you to work together on this one. Okay, because like I said, these are not easy. So we're going to look at filter. We're going to look at find. Filter is very, 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 actually, we'll look at filter and we'll look at one more after. Filter and find are very similar, so we won't do both. So let's look at the information. The filter method, and this is in bold, creates a new array with all elements that pass the test implemented by the provided function. So there's 2 pieces of really good information in there. 1, creates a new array, which means, is it modifying our existing array? No. So we end up with two arrays. The one that has the updated, modified array, and the original array. That information is critical because we need to know what we end up with after we run this. Filter creates a new array with all the elements that pass the test. So think about the function I wrote that said, hey, go through all these strings and only keep the ones that are less than 3 characters. 3 characters or less than 4 characters. They passed my test of, are you less than 4 characters? Yes, you pass, you're in the new array, you're in the club, okay? That's what filter's doing. How filter works, again, I don't know. It's a black box. I don't need to know. What it's asking me to do is write the test. Write a block of code that contains a test. True or false? That's all it wants to know. How do I know that? We come down here, and it says, what does it take? So this is the same pattern. R.filter instead of R.forEach. Callback, element index array. That is the exact same pattern as this. Element index array. Callback. Function is a predicate. What is a predicate? It's a good question, I actually don't know. To test each element of the array. Return true to keep the element, return false otherwise. So all my function needs to do is return true if I want to keep the element in question, or return false if I don't. So let's take this, let's bring it down here. Let's create an array. Let's go steal that array from the previous exercise. I have an array of strings. And on my array of strings, I'm going to call filter. And based on the documentation, it says it's going to provide me an element, an index, an array. If I want all 3 of them, I can take them. See, same pattern. Same pattern as for each. But the big thing is that it says return true to keep the element. Remember, this is a function. It's a block of code. I need to provide feedback to filter, because filter is going to create a new array only keeping the elements that pass my test. How does it know? It knows because I'm going to return true or false. I'm going to say yes, 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 no, yes, yes, no, yes, no, no, no. But how do I determine that? A little test. If element, right? We got the element, which is this, that, foo, I, software. One at a time. If element dot length less than 3, less than 4, right? Keep the ones with 4 characters. Return true. Else? Return false. Now, another little thing. I am not modifying this array. It says that in the documentation. It creates a new array. How do I capture that? By assigning it. It has a return value. A new array with the elements that pass the test. If no elements pass the test, an empty array will be returned. Awesome, I get all the information I need. Const. Filtered array. Arbitrary block of code that I pass to something else. I don't know how it works before, I don't know how it works after, I don't care. You tell me that you're going to give me 3 pieces of information, 2 of which I don't need, so I'll just pop them right off. And I'm just going to operate with that. And then if we look at the results, print out the new array and the original array to demonstrate that, yeah, it wasn't touched. So I get my filtered array, it created that new array for me, and I didn't touch the original one. Right on.
Can I just see it again?
Yeah.
It's just interesting that all of it's in.
Yeah, because I'm probably not going to use this again, because this is very specific to what I'm trying to do to this piece of this array. So like, functions serve 2 purposes. Functions serve, one, as a chunk of code that we can reuse. That's a really good use for a function. Give it a name, right? Do something, and we can reuse it over and over and over again. But functions also serve as a really great way to pass in, here's just a block of code to run. For each element in this array, run this block of code. Like the thing is, filter doesn't care how big my test is, what sort of crazy shit that I need to do in there. It doesn't care. All it cares about is 1, I'm returning true or false, and 2, I gave it code. It's going to run my code, and it's expecting back true or false. That's what it's expecting. And that way, that will help it know which things to keep and which things to throw away. How it's creating this new array and keeping things, I don't know. I don't know how it does it. I don't care. That's not the point. The point is, it's abstracted away from me. I don't need to worry about that. And that's really nice. That's one less thing to worry about. Now, I would typically make this better by doing this. Why does this work? What does this stuff in parentheses, which I will take away shortly, what does this stuff in parentheses return? What does this return?
True or false?
True or false? I don't have to say, if this is true, return true. If this is false, return false. I can just say, return the thing, right? Return what it evaluates to, which makes it even better.
Can you return some other stuff, like the value?
No, because it's expecting true or false. So if I return something else, it's going to treat it as truthy or falsy. So if I return a 0,
It's false.
it's false. If I return a 1, it's true. It's expecting a Boolean back. That's how filter works. That's filter, and you see that same concept. Element, index, array. And you can see it again over here. Element, callback, element, index, array, this arg. Same exact pattern. This piece is a little bit different because it says return true to keep, return false otherwise. And the return value is a little bit different because for each, the return value is undefined. It returns nothing of interest. This, however, returns a new array with the elements that pass the test. So you probably want to keep that. If you don't, you just wasted all your work. If you're not keeping what it's passing back, you wasted your work. right? It's like saying this. What does that do? Nothing. Right? Just 5. Is it printing it out? Nope. Is it valid? Yep. One more, then lunch. Find. Find is similar but different. Find, actually find is like identical. Find returns the value of the first element provided array that satisfies. Find method returns the value of the first element in the provided array that satisfies the provided testing function. Oh, we're writing another predicate, another test. If you need the index, here's some notes. If you need the index of the element that you found, use find index instead. If you need to find the index of a value, you can say index of blah 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 blah. Non-important. Here's what's important. Oh my god, it's the same pattern. Find, callback, element, index, array. Callback, function to execute on each value of the array, taking 3 arguments, element, index, array. Return value, the value of the first element that satisfies the provided testing function, false otherwise. So, there's actually, I feel like there's a big chunk of information here missing, and it's this piece that's in the description. The find method executes a callback function once for each index of the array until callback returns truthy. It's exactly the same as filter, except with one major difference. What does find do instead of, what does filter do and what does find do? So I can literally just do this. But what is my, what's going to change now? What's the value of filtered array going to be? Foo. Just the string foo. No longer an array, just the value of the first thing that it found that satisfied my test. And obviously it didn't modify the original array because it's not pulling it out, it's just finding it and saying, here it is. First 4-letter word. First number that's called 81. First whatever you want. But you see again, the same pattern. The same pattern. Callback function. Return something because it needs to know how to make its decision. I need to tell it, I'm the one who decides how the comparison goes, what to look for, when to return true or false. All I need to tell it is, keep it or don't keep it. And my block of code is deciding that. Callback functions. Array methods. When we come back, I have a list of exercises that you will need the afternoon to do. Because you're also going to need to do some research about this. So everything that we haven't covered will be in here. Not everything, but the ones the big ones that I think are important are an exercise, readings related to today's classes. For each, join, we already looked at, filter, find, sort, and map are the other 2 that I want you to take a look at. Sort and map. Sort is totally different, okay? And there's only one question related to it. But I want you to take a look. That's the push I want you to make. And then map is also kind of interesting. Okay? It follows the same pattern, but what it does is unique. Any questions? Okay? Let's take lunch. If you think of anything, I'll be around after lunch so we can do it then. And we'll quickly